division. It's also known as the thoracolumbar because it involves spinal nerves T1 through L2, or at least fibers from T1 through L2. The green fibers represent preganglionic, the red ones represent postganglionic neurons. What do I want to tell you next? I'm drawing a blank here. So much to tell you. Ganglion. Let's talk about the ganglion. We know that in an autonomic pathway, preganglionic fiber synapses with the postganglionic fiber at what's called an autonomic ganglion. In the sympathetic division, those ganglia are called the sympathetic chain ganglia. There's one on either side of the spinal cord, so one lateral to each side of the spinal cord. And they form this little chain. And it goes up and down the spinal cord. There's also three other ganglia called collateral ganglia. And these are found in the abdominal cavity. I don't want you to know the names of them. That's not important to me. But I want you to know that there are other ganglia besides the sympathetic chain ganglia where these fibers can synapse. So here's the ganglia. Here's the preganglionic fiber. Here's the postganglionic fiber. The neurotransmitter released by the preganglionic fiber is always going to be acetylcholine. Always, regardless if it's sympathetic or parasympathetic. That preganglionic fiber is always going to release acetylcholine. Acetylcholine will bind to receptors on that postganglionic fiber, which will then cause that nerve signal to be started again in that postganglionic fiber. Now, remember, it's been a little while, but back in Chapter 12, we talked about synaptic transmission and what happens. So one of the ways you may want to consider studying and putting this all together is describing what happens when this releases its, let's say the nerve signal comes down here. Describe how that neurotransmitter then induces this signal to begin here, because that is what's happening. That acetylcholine is being released. How does that happen? What triggers it? How is calcium involved? What happens with the synaptic vesicles? Now, in the sympathetic division, the neurotransmitter released by the postganglionic fiber, 99 out of 100 times, is norepinephrine. Now, that doesn't mean that the neuron is going to change and at different times secrete different neurotransmitters. No. A neuron is pretty much committed to secreting a specific neurotransmitter every time. 99 out of 100 times, what I mean by that is that there are some instances when we talk about some skin glands where instead of releasing norepinephrine, the postganglionic fiber does release acetylcholine. Well, that's an exception to the rule. It's just simpler for us if we just know that that postganglionic fiber is going to secrete norepinephrine. And what class of neurotransmitter is norepinephrine? Okay, now I'm bringing chapter 12 into it. Again, it is a catecholamine, which falls into what other big group of neurotransmitters, which also includes melatonin and serotonin? Monoamines, meaning they have one amino group, one nitrogen-containing group. Okay, what else here? So we're talking about fight or flight. Let me give you a situation. So you're walking down a dark alley at night for whatever reason. And there's trash cans all over because you're behind some restaurants, rats and cats. And all of a sudden a cat jumps out and knocks over a garbage can and it just scares the heck out of you. What do you physiologically feel happening to you? What physiologically do you feel changing? What happens? Okay, your heart rate goes up. What else are you going to experience as a result of being scared by that cat in that dark alley?
Your eyes are going to widen.
You're going to get pupillary dilation. Eyes dilate, allow more light in, help you see a little bit better, perhaps. Now keep in mind, this fight or flight mechanism is very, very primitive. It's almost, I don't want to say instinctual, but in a way it kind of is. So if you are going to stick around and defend your life or run away from the situation to preserve your life, what events or what things would have to happen to you so you can be able to do that? Yes, heart rate goes up. Pupillary dilation so you can see better. What else? You're going to have increased amount of epinephrine, norepinephrine. By the way, adrenaline and epinephrine are the same thing. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. You're going to have an increased release of that. I'll come back and talk about these in a minute. Okay, what else? You're going to have an increase in blood glucose levels. Why? What would glucose be important for in this situation? What? Generating ATP. Glucose is broken down to produce ATP. What would ATP be used for? Muscle movement. Okay, I'm going to reset this because I'll add to it. So we're going to have increased muscle contraction, so we're going to need ATP for that. So increased glucose leads to increased ATP because of increased muscle contraction. It's kind of a cause and effect here. All right, so I'll just put that in parentheses. All right. How is that glucose going to get to your skeletal muscles? Okay, heart rate goes up, that increases your blood pressure, but you want to increase the flow of blood to those skeletal muscle cells. So what we're going to see is we're going to see a vasodilation of blood vessels that go to the skeletal muscle and to the cardiac muscle. We want to increase the amount of blood that's able to flow to those organs. More blood to skeletal muscle means more glucose delivery, more oxygen delivery, more ATP production. Therefore, we can sustain muscle contraction longer. Now, I mentioned oxygen here. What would happen to what would need to be done in order to provide increased oxygen to the skeletal muscles so that they can make ATP? Breathing rate is going to have to change. Not only breathing rate, but the volume of air that's being brought into the lungs. And so what we'll see is we will see what's called bronchodilation. The tubes that supply the air to the lungs. Have you done respiratory in lab yet? Is that today? This week? Well, the bronchial tubes, the bronchial tree is what allows the air to travel down into your lungs. And so they're surrounded by smooth muscle. And so those smooth muscles will relax, and those vessels, those bronchial tubes will dilate, creating a greater diameter, allowing air to flow more smoothly and unrestricted into the lungs. So we're going to see increased bronchodilation as well. Now, those are all things that are going to help you in this fight or flight situation. What types of things are we not going to want to have to do? And I say we, I'm thinking automatically, what types of things does our body not want to be doing while we're fighting or running away? You don't want to have to be doing digestion. So we're going to see a decrease in digestive activities. That includes a decrease in gastrointestinal motility. In other words, we're not moving food through the digestive tract. That includes a decrease in the amount of glandular secretions related to digestion. That includes a decrease in the amount, well, that's digestion. Okay. We're going to see vasoconstriction of blood vessels that provide blood to the digestive tract. We want that blood to be diverted to places where it needs to be most. Doesn't mean there's no blood going to your digestive tract. We're just not sending as much. We want that blood to be used elsewhere. What else do we not want to have to be worrying about while we're running away or flying away or staying and fighting? You don't want to have to stop and say, "Oh, I got to go to the bathroom." Okay. So what we're going to see is we're going to see a decrease in urinary output. We're going to see a decrease in the amount of filtration that's occurring in the kidneys. Now, for some reason, sometimes in situations like that, people do. Their sphincter relaxes, both of them, digestive and urinary sometimes. It shouldn't happen, but it does, and I don't know the exact mechanism, but sometimes in situations like that, yes, you wet yourself or you fill your pants, for lack of a better description. Okay? But that's typically not what happens because the sympathetic is supposed to inhibit those. Yeah, more than likely. You're gonna decrease the reproductive activities as well. So that is all the things that are going to happen in that type of situation. Now I want to come back and talk briefly about the epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. All three of those are not just neurotransmitters, classified as monoamines, but they're also hormones. Same exact chemical, just released in a different way. As neurotransmitters, they're released from neurons. As hormones, they're released from the adrenal medulla. You can see right down here, this thing. That's the adrenal medulla. And that is going to be stimulated by the sympathetic to release those three hormones. They end up in the blood. They circulate through the entire body. And they have the same effect that norepinephrine would when it's secreted by a neuron. So not only do you have nervous system stimulation occurring on the heart and the lungs, the digestive system and everything else, you also have hormonal stimulation. And what that does is it maintains these sympathetic effects for a longer period of time. So you could be in a situation where you get really scared about something. Okay, that's your adrenaline kicking in. And 2 hours later, you're still kind of shaken about the whole incident. It's because you have a large amount of these catecholamines still circulating in your blood. They may not be secreted anymore, but they're still being circulated in your blood. They're still being processed by the body and haven't totally been broken down, and those levels haven't been totally decreased yet. So that's why after a fight or flight situation, you could still be shaking. You could still just be visibly almost upset, just because of those hormones still circulating. All right. Any questions about this sympathetic division? To answer your question, Kathy. All right. So here is a section through the spinal cord. We can see our dorsal root. Here's our ventral root. Here's our spinal nerve. Well, what happens with the sympathetic division is these sympathetic fibers can do a couple different things. Number one, they will always go and synapse in a ganglion. Now, whether it's the ganglion at the same level of that spinal nerve, or if it's a ganglion above or below that spinal nerve, doesn't matter. It will synapse at a ganglion. Or it could actually pass through the ganglion and synapse at one of those collateral ganglia. But these here are those chain ganglia, the sympathetic chain ganglia. And you can see that's where that postganglionic fiber is going to be. Now, what was your original question again?
About the somatic.
Okay. So the sympathetic fibers will always kind of take a turn here and go into that chain, whereas the autonomic or the somatic fibers, which is what this purple one is representing, it would still just come out here. Let me draw it on here. It would go like this, and it would just go straight out this way. Because here's the spinal nerve here. Correct. Yeah, it doesn't need a ganglion. And we can see right here with this red one, this postganglionic fiber here goes back into that spinal nerve fiber, or spinal nerve at that point. Or it could do it at another level as well. Now we'll talk more about these pathways next semester and where they go, what they do, and why they're used. All right, parasympathetic.